Good morning. My name is Victor Murinde. I'm the Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium. Let me first of all thank the East African Association, in particular Agnes Gitau, for inviting me to give the opening lecture of the 2025 East African Association meeting. Also, I would like to apologize for not being able to make it in person to be with you much as would have liked, but there was an intervention that could not make it possible for me to travel to London from Nairobi. Before I go into the theme of my opening lecture, let me first introduce the African Economic Research Consortium, in particular paying attention to the role that the consortium plays in working with governments and the private sector to support reforms in the area of trade and investment in the East African region and beyond. The EARC was founded in 1988 as a Pan-African institution headquartered in Nairobi. And we do have a capacity building framework that encompasses research, top research, breaking ground in terms of research areas, also involves training, building the capacity of economists across the continent. And thirdly, involving policy engagement, involving engagement with the policymakers across Africa, and also private sector practitioners across Africa. We are now on a 5-year strategy, which we have converted into a 10-year strategy, 2025-2035, on a renewed AERC for Africa's new development priorities. This introduction to serve that what I will present in this opening lecture is drawing from the research that EARC has been able to do over the years, conversations with the policymakers and private sector practitioners in East Africa and across Africa, and also to make a pledge that we are committed to work with the East African Association to do more research, provide more empirical parameters, provide more input into strategies to enhance trade and investment in the region. So that is the EARC. Now, let me now go into the thrust of the opening lecture. We are looking at how we can achieve economic transformation in East Africa through trade and investment. And the key element of this presentation is that we need to think towards shifting from aid to trade and investment, simply because of the global imperatives happening today. Just if you compare ODA and official aid received in the East African region, compared with personal remittances received, compared with FDI received, and compared with exports of goods and services, in a short period of 2020-2021, this chart is unequivocal. It brings out the message that ODA has declined modestly from 2020, remittances continue to rise, and the FDI also rising steadily. But in particular, the average values in this period for Burundi, DRC, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda show that exports of goods and services have increased. And therefore, countries should not be worried about shifting from aid or shifting from BA to strategies that enable them to trade and invest more among themselves and across the world. That's the message that we can start with. And if I could just bring to the fore the comparing narratives, the reality of the global fragmentation, the reality of the fragmented global economy is that aid and ODI have declined, are dying, they're stopping immediately. This is the narrative that is emerging. But in response to that change in the fragmented global economy, Africa needs to rely more and shift towards other income sources. For example, increase in exports to reflect the productive capacity of these African countries, personal remittances from diaspora and other people working across the world, those have remained stable and proved to be a reliable source of income. And strategy should be, how could this be enhanced further and made more productive? In addition, FDI has shown to be stable, so it's a growing trend. In other words, the narrative, the compelling narrative, is that there's great potential for East Africa to shift to reliable and sustainable income, diversifying away from the aid performance that has been the case since 1945, the end of Second World War. But we need perhaps to first look at the big picture in terms of intra-East African trade. Are the East African countries trading more among themselves? The answer to the big picture is yes. The East African community continues to deepen economic integration, but intra-regional trade and investment remains below the potential. And this is a wake-up call to governments and private sector and ourselves to work towards strategies of ensuring that it's going beyond potential. But what is the problem? The problem, simply and squarely, is that non-tariff barriers among the East African countries themselves remain the main challenge. So you have non-tariff barriers, NTBs, among the countries, but also globally among in the global world. And recent citation of the barriers, even tariff barriers in the US is an example. But whereas we can be able to methodically deal with pronounced tariff barriers in terms of interventions and strategies, non-tariff barriers become a problem because they are less predictable. So what we see in the big picture is that intra-East African trade has risen in 2023 to $12.1 billion. And that is an increase of 13.1 year on year. Very great news. 15% of East African total merchandise trade of this is, is intra-African. There is a need, just about 0.6 billion. So the strategies, we have to work together toward those that enable to increase the intra-African trade. There is also the second element of the big picture about exports. Exports from East Africa to the rest of the world are mainly primary commodities. However, manufactured goods are being sold in regional markets. That includes textiles, chemicals, edible oil, cement, iron and steel, cosmetic, pharmaceuticals. And here is an area that we need to focus on how to actually be able to create value added from primary commodities to manufacturing. But there is always a big elephant missing the room, especially when we talk about intra-East African trade. The emphasis normally is on goods, but we forget that trade in services is equally important. Trade in services include transport, tourism, professions like lawyers, accountants, medical services, even education. That is a very important area to exploit for East Africa. At the moment, there is a bit significant, or 40% of GDP in several partner states. But there is need of underlining the trade in services, financial services, commercial services, professional services. Let us also see the big picture in terms of total trade across numbers. When you look at this chart that compares total trade for 2022 with total trade the year later, 2023, you see a clear pattern. That intra-East African trade increased in 2023, but only for two countries, namely Uganda and Rwanda. We need to identify what remains the rest of the other trading partners. It also showed that regional exports were higher than imports in both periods, which is brilliant news for the balance of payments. This information or this evidence is important for us to design our strategies, to rethink how to move beyond 2025. We have covered trade, but equally we need to look at investment, because we're looking at the analysis of how post-ODA, post-aid, we're going to be able to develop this area of trade and investment. The intra-East African investment, first of all, to get the pictures, who investing where, and an implicit question is why. Okay. Now, we use this presentation of showing the countries, the 5 countries, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Kenya, compare the 2022 intra-East African investment with 2023 thereafter. We note that planned intra-East African investment declined by 5.6 to 567 million in 2023. The cause of the decline is what is interesting. This decline reflects investor caution amid global uncertainty and domestic policy shifts. The global uncertainty is exogenous. We have to be able to devise means of strengthening our economies to insulate these African countries against global uncertainty. That's a policy shift. But where there is a domestic policy shift is somewhere where we need to examine our domestic policy shift, especially in opening up and facilitating the creation of production and value addition of products. The main sectors indeed are energy and gas, extractives, services, ICT communication, software, consumer products, and biotech showing some momentum. But you see, if you look at these main sectors, you find a narrow band of sectors. And as we pick momentum with the current strategies, we need to be able to design a strategy that can increase the momentum. Okay, so if you go country by country, you find within 2022 and 2023, we are now still developing analyzing numbers for 2024. We find that in Uganda, there's a decline in a planned intra-East African investment. But we find a significant jump in Burundi. And actually, that is starting from the lower base. We find that in Rwanda, there is an increase in East African investment inflows into Rwanda. A fall in Tanzania, but very temporary, because there has been a big gain in Tanzania. And in Kenya, we find a large drop in investment into Kenya. And the question is why? But let's take still the big picture. What is on our radar? The broad picture is that compared to the rest of the world, comparing East Africa with the rest of Africa, and comparing East Africa with other trading partners around the globe, the East African community is a rising investment destination. And that's the good news. With the growth rates of 5.1, a large population of 305.3 million, a substantial market for labor force. If labor is made to be mobile, and that's an aspect that I will pick issues with. And then, of course, we project when we do forecasting and simulation based on the anticipated growth in many areas, we find that we project a growth of 6.8, which is modest for the period 2026-2027. And if that is achieved, then intra-East African trade will increase by 13.1, reaching 12.1 billion in 2023 and thereafter. And that's the projection you find on the chart here, the East African economic growth projections based on stochastic simulations and experiments done with large observations. Another big picture is to look at what are the East African community priority investment sectors. That's important because the work we have done within the EARC and work that I have done over the years, the last 10 years, shows that it matters where the investments goes. And with the Desiree Kanga, East of Somalia, and with Botiano, we analyzed every sector in Africa that receives the FDI. And our conclusion was that the angel is in the details. That we have to repurpose the destination of FDI. We have to identify sectors that can be leading sectors for growth, because the catalytic element, the propensity to expand production, is different across the sectors. The cross-cutting produce sectors for East Africa are very promising. So you have agriculture, could get value added there. You have tourism, that is services for foreign exchange and job creation. We have manufacturing, again, a manufacturing linked to agriculture, because now here is a new element, because there was less attention paid to industrial policy. There is now a shift towards industrial policy, which will address manufacturing, address mining, especially critical minerals, address energy, address infrastructure needs, the digital transformation that I'll come back to, and then the finance that I'll come back to, and health. These 9 sectors are potential destination sectors for increasing investment, especially when we think of East Africa as a priority investment sector. Now, there are variations, however, if you want to go into country-specific investment focus. There are great variations. In Kenya, with the big 4, affordable housing, manufacturing, healthcare, food security. With Rwanda, there's 3 financial services and others. With Uganda, agriculture, mining, energy. Tanzania, what we are showing here is that even when the East African region is one integrated region, there is a high degree of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity across the East African region is good news. It means that they can continue to concentrate on their best efforts and then trade among themselves more, and together export more to the rest of the world. That's the whole purpose of the heterogeneity across these South African countries. Broadly, what type of investment flows are being received into East Africa? Broadly, I can say quickly, FDI, what is, and there has been increase. Portfolio investment, very important, the purchase of financial assets without obtaining controlling interest in the underlying company. Portfolio investment is major, is increasing because of the growth in stock exchanges across, especially the Nairobi Stock Exchange. There are some stock exchange and others which are growing. And then there is also another dimension of investment flows, other capital flows. That includes development finance, DFI, and venture capital and private equity, and of course, remittances. So these are the main ones. And now, policy and practice by private sector, company CEOs, and policymakers have then to see the combination, the leveraging of these 3 types into being able to get a menu that can finance investment for companies and for the governments. In terms of the portfolio investment as a group of investment, portfolio investment and capital markets, what do we really know? We know that portfolio investment in East Africa has room for expansion. And as economies grow, there is a high margin of propensity to expand portfolio investment. There is a feedback mechanism between the portfolio investment and growth. And in particular, drawing the corner and allowing a lot of cross-listing and foreign exchange leadership from the Nairobi Stock Exchange and the CE and Assam Stock Exchange, the 2 main exchanges, and working with the other exchanges which are still growing up, but which needs to work in collaboration. It's a region, it's an historical region. And these markets need to be very regional, with key benefits of capital provision, hybrid financing, diversification, getting market depth, much more liquidity, and then affording regional integration and financial integration, of course. And then, of course, with higher growth indication. So the main reason here, the main argument here that I want to bring forward is leveraging. To be able to combine different sources from development finance for long-term capital investment, especially as we enhance our industrial policy and want to go into long-term ventures and infrastructure. A venture capital and private equity to be able to base the structure of companies, emanating from from small and medium enterprises, growth into higher companies. And of course, the magic of remittances. The remittances is an area that has high potential, but less policy actions have been undertaken here to enhance, to be able to strategize on how remittances can be increased in combination with households and the private and companies, i.e. the private sector. And our key insight is that these alternative capital flows complement traditional FDI and portfolio investment. They enable us to create a more diverse and resilient investment ecosystem in East Africa. Of course, to be able to do this, to enhance production, to enhance trade, to enhance investment, the current trajectories around the world is the digital revolution. We need to unlock East African digital potential. Just to highlight 4 areas that are on our radar as the African Economic Research Consortium. The first is FinTech, the financial technology. Now, over the last 4 years, I've also produced so many papers in this area, focusing on Africa and globally, personally as a researcher. But also the EARC biannual meeting in December 2024 was on the FinTech revolution in Africa. Of course, this has the greatest potential for the region, based on what we are now calling the Nairobi Silicon Savannah, which was established East African Technology Hub with numerous local and international investors backing innovative tech companies across the region. And this should grow. It should grow e-commerce. It should grow the health tech. It should also agri-tech, especially quite a number of randomized controlled trials have been done in agri-tech that shows that technology can drive not only production, but farming methods overall. So here is the opportunity to unlock East Africans' digital potential. But if we look into if we unlock that potential, and especially focus on using that potential for energy transitions, transition into clean energy, and also for developing infrastructure, let's take a stock and see where are we heading in this this terrain of energy transition and infrastructure development. The good news is, I think we are heading in the right direction. Thus, these 3 sectors of renewable energy, transport infrastructure, and construction represent significant investment opportunities for private sector companies globally, from the UK, from the rest of the world, into East Africa. These 3 sectors have strong government support and also has local, growing private sector involvement locally. So they are potential areas. So in renewable energy, you are thinking about geothermal energy, you are thinking about solar power, you are thinking about wind power projects, and then strategy with the clear strategy goals. In transport infrastructure, you are thinking about railways. West African countries seriously in this area, the ports, road networks, across the East African countries. And construction, you are thinking of commercial buildings, residential housing, public facilities. All these are growth area. That is where we are heading. In terms of agriculture and agribusiness, keeps coming up. There is a big promise. Okay, there's a big promise. And the transformation journey is the one journey of whereby the East African countries are proceeding from what has been subsistence farming almost for the last 100 years, to be honest, into commercial agribusiness of different. So agriculture remains a cornerstone of East African economics, now leading more into agro-based processing and manufacturing. Okay, but the investments are transforming the sector from traditional farming to commercial agribusiness, and that is the message, especially in 3 areas of value-added processing, important. The construction of value chain logistics, this actually enables those value chains, enables the East African country to connect to the African continental free trade area across the 54 main countries of Africa. And then the creation of modern farming technologies being developed to expand farming equipment and combining technology, that's the technical power, with the methods, especially for irrigation, improved seed varieties, and other mechanisms. And therefore, as we mentioned, we are proceeding from agribusiness to manufacturing, and with an expansion now industrial policy. You see, this is revolutionary. If 20 years ago, you talked about industrial policy, or in the 1980s, you talked about industrial policy, people would think this, you are crazy. Okay. It was mainly about macroeconomic stability. Of course, the emphasis now is more across the world, not only in East Africa or in Africa, across the world, in industrial policy. So here is that the technocrats in government offices would be able to look at manufacturing industrial growth, and the private sector also to see the participation, increase the participation in industrialization. And so the potential for manufacturing industrial growth exists like never before, like never before. And that's because the East African governments actively promote industrialization, leading to increased investment in manufacturing across diverse sectors. And 4 sectors I want to highlight here, which are on our radar: light manufacturing, consumer goods, plastics, packaging, textiles and apparel, again, especially benefiting from the African Continental Free Trade Area, pharmaceuticals, including agriculture-based pharmaceuticals, and then automotive assembly, which is, again, both taking automotive assembly plants from the digital technology. So East African manufacturing, the insight we get from here, the key insight is that East African manufacturing is diversifying beyond the traditional sectors with growing emphasis on value-added and low-content development. Even when we look at the FDI data, we find a lot of encouraging results. And here, the leading, especially with Kenya and Rwanda. We find also leading indicators with strong emphasis on Tanzania and Uganda. We find less activity in DRC, Burundi, South Sudan, and Somalia. I think fragility is a very important aspect here that we have to deal with: peace, security, and production. The main challenges and opportunities: political instability, I mentioned fragility; regulation uncertainties, this needs synchronization; infrastructure gaps being identified; energy access issues, those are challenges. But opportunities, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area implementation. We have the democratic dividend, if we can increase skills building. We have trade openness growth, and of course, natural resources. The opportunities are many. Now, if we peer into the twilight zone, what are the future investment outlook and trends? I think green energy investment, let's focus on that. Digital economic expansion, let's focus on that. Deepening European integration, let's focus on that, because that brings us positivity and high degree of promise. In terms of investment incentive compatibility, they need to give regional investment policies and incentives, tax incentives, regulatory frameworks, infrastructure, and promotion. And especially, there are variations across the member countries, but there is also harmonization and consistency. So let me conclude, I'm running out of time. Let me conclude that we at the EARC, African Economic Research Consortium, EARC, we are standing in readiness to co-design with the East African community and with the EAA, the readiness to work with governments and private sector and co-produce, co-design the strategies. The East African Trade and Investment Story in 2023 shows resilience and transition from foreign aid to regional trade investment. That can be done. There is no doubt about it. The regional intra-trade value is increasing. Intra-investment is shifting towards more diversified areas, especially manufacturing services. The direction is positive. The direction of travel is positive. But non-tariff barriers remain a problem. Infrastructure constraints remain a problem. Policy fragmentation remain a problem. And these have to be addressed through designing strategies. So the East African region should consolidate gains in regional manufacturing, regional growing exports, and integrate policies towards to reduce NTBs and challenge to trade. Leveraging on larger trade blocks such as the FTA would help these countries better. Indeed, the EARC is your partner, whether you are the East African Association or East African Community Governments or private sector. Thank you very much. We stand behind you. Thank you.